Morning folks, I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters in the Pathfinder School, and what I thought I'd do this morning is shoot a very quick and basic video on knife safety. And this video can go along with the two videos that I shot recently about simple knife projects, and I kind of put the cart before the horse there, I guess, for people who are actually new to bushcrafting or use that are new to knife use. And there should be a knife safety video that's kind of a prelude to those videos. So I thought today I would shoot that video. So let's first talk about what type of knife to start out with for someone who is not used to doing this type of work and not used to whittling and carving and things like that with their hands and a knife, because there's certain knives that are better for the task than others. And a knife that you want to use for craft work, hence the term bushcraft, is not the same as what you would consider a survival knife. Okay, there is a difference there in my opinion. And a crafting knife is something that has a smaller blade. When I say smaller, I'm talking probably 4 inches or less. It has a fairly thin blade as far as the blade width, and it also has a fairly narrow blade as far as the thickness of the material that blade is made from. It doesn't necessarily have to be full tang, because it may not be used as a survival knife. But it needs to be light in the hand, comfortable in the hand, and ergonomically comfortable for you to use, so that you can use it for extended periods of time, and it needs to hold a good sharp edge. And a couple knives that I could suggest to you really quick off the top of my head, if you wanted to get into a knife that was more of a survival slash bushcraft knife, or something that you may be able to use for more of an emergency tool if you needed to, because you didn't have a saw or an axe, you could go with something like the Pathfinder Scorpion. This is a 1/8 inch blade, so it has a fairly narrow blade width. It has a fairly narrow profile as far as the width goes, which makes it good for fine carving tasks. And it has a Scandinavian grind, and it has about a 4.5 inch blade. So this would be on the upper end of knives, I would say, would be good for crafting work. But it's a good all-around knife, and it is full tang with walnut handles. So it's a really good knife. It feels good in the hand ergonomically to me, and it's a very good knife for doing crafting type work. If you want to get into a lesser expensive knife to start your quest in bushcraft, there's nothing wrong with that. And there are plenty of knives out there, you know, for $20 or less, like Mora. And the Mora Companion is probably one of the better knives on the market for that right now, because it kind of fits in that niche of bushcraft. It's got the nice 4.5, 4 3/4 inch blade on it, Scandinavian grind, fairly thin blade thickness and width, and it's got a good ergonomically comfortable rubberized grip on it, a good heavy-duty plastic sheath, and there's nothing wrong with the sheath right out of the box. I have modified mine somewhat in that I have a sail needle taped to the back of it. Part of my 5-tool rule is something that you can punch and lace fabric with, and then it also has just a rubber O-ring slid inside here on the belt loop area for more retention in the bush. There's no way that thing's ever going to get lost. But I've never had one of these fall out of the sheath without that retention either. So this Companion in carbon steel is a very, very good knife. Now, it doesn't really matter for crafting work whether you have stainless steel or whether you have carbon steel or whether you have laminated steel. Any of those will work. It's really a more a matter of personal preference for you. I know a lot of fine craftsmen that would rather have carbon steel because you can get a better edge on carbon steel, and it's easier to resharpen carbon steel than it is stainless. The flip side of that is stainless doesn't take as much to maintain, and once you get it sharp, it holds that sharp edge for a very long period of time. So there's schools of thought both directions for that, and I would say that for a crafting knife, whichever one you choose and works best for you is great. You could also go with something, especially if you're dealing with youth, you could go with something more along the lines of the 510 or 511 series Moras, which have a nice guard on them right here so that you can't slip up on the blade. They have a nice wide barrel grip on them, typical to a Mora. They have a nice, about a 4-inch blade on them with a really thin profile, nice Scandinavian grind. This is a really, really good crafting knife. In fact, it's one of my favorite crafting knives of the Mora line. And it's cheap. This thing is like 10, 12 bucks. Again, I've just put an O-ring on mine for extra security, but the versatility of these Mora sheaths, as far as how you can wear them, where you can put them, where you can stick them and stash them, makes them a very good choice for this kind of stuff. And for a beginner that doesn't have a lot of money, you know, more is definitely the way to go because they're inexpensive and they're a quality knife. All right, so we're going to use this knife in our demonstration today. And the first thing we're going to talk about, a couple things, is knife safety in general in your area and personally. Okay, the first two things that I teach my students, well, one of the first three things is, first of all, is how to grip the knife. And you grip the knife with a fist grip like you're holding a hammer or an axe. With a fist grip is how you hold the knife. You don't want your thumb hanging out up here. You don't want your fingers hanging out over the guard. You want a good fist grip on that knife, and that's going to give you good control and good safety. The next thing you need to remember is what's called the blood circle. And the blood circle is anywhere at least within 180 degrees of your work area, but really more like 360, of anyone that could walk into your area or is generally in your proximity when you're working with a knife. That is your blood circle. You want to make sure that no one's within that blood circle while you're working with your knife. Were you to flail off on something like this, which goes back to lack of control, but if it were to happen, you don't want someone in your blood circle that can get cut. The next thing is called the triangle of death, and the triangle of death is this area right here between your groin and your two femoral arteries. You don't ever want to be doing work in that triangle of death with your knife. You always want to stay in front of or outside that triangle of death when you're working with your knife, because you can bleed out very quickly from a femoral artery injury if you sever that artery, and groin injuries bleed profusely as well. So you have to be very careful with that. If you remember those three things, you've got a good start. Okay, so let's talk about for a minute working with a piece of wood. Now I like to turn sideways to work a piece of wood, and generally speaking I like to draw the wood toward me and hold the knife stationary. So if I hold my knife in that fist grip and I'm trying to reduce this material, I can control that knife very well by keeping it in a stationary position. I don't have any choice or any chance of that knife flying off anywhere or going anywhere. And everything I do is going to be easily controllable. And when I'm making something like a feather stick, this is really the way I prefer to do it, is to do it in a braced position like this. Now you can also brace this thing on something and do more of a shear cut, but remember that a knife blade is a slicing motion. They're not made to do push cuts. Now you can do push cuts with them, but they're made to slice. And if you take a knife and you put it on your skin and you push it down, it won't cut you. But as soon as you move it just a hair, it's going to slice you open. So you have to remember that. And when you are cutting material, if you use the entire blade of that knife to cut with, like this, you're going to get those fine curled shavings better than you're going to get them if you're push cutting. And if you draw that material towards you, you can draw it up the blade just like this and rotate the material, and that will work just fine. But any of this will work. Now, let's talk about just a push cut. A push cut is used to remove material. So if I'm going to push material off, that push cut straight down toward the ground is going to remove massive amounts of material fairly quickly. I can push cut that material off there to reduce this fairly quickly if I want to. Okay, now let's talk about what's called the knee lever type grip. And what you're going to do is you're going to put your leg up like this so that you're outside the triangle of death again. And you're going to hold the knife against your leg like this on the outside. So if you're right-handed, it would be on the other side. And then you can manipulate that wood towards you to either push cut or to do fine slicing motions by dragging it up the blade like this. Again, you're holding the knife stationary, so you don't have any chance of slipping off. I like anything that will hold the knife stationary when I'm using it. I would rather do that than to be doing this. If I'm doing this, I don't have control. I don't have even pressure. If I pull that material toward me, it gives me a more even pressure across the material. It gives me finer control to get smaller slices if I'm trying to do fine work. And it's much easier to do that than it is to try to hold this thing and move the knife to get those finer cuts. At least in this manner. If you're actually carving where you're cutting towards yourself, that's a whole different scenario when you're doing wood carving. Those are different than basic knife use. In basic knife use, you're not going to cut towards yourself most of the time. So being able to control that material to get those fine cuts and keep that blade in one particular spot is going to make things much more effective for you. And you'll be able to do the task easier than if you're trying to push the knife all the time. It's not really a whittling motion, it's manipulating the material. And you can do full-on push cuts the same way by pulling the material straight at the knife, just like this. And you can get those same results that you could get the other way, but you can do it with a knee lever. So you're holding the knife against your knee from a seated position, just like this. Okay? Okay, so the last cutting technique that I want to show you, as far as a basic beginner's cutting technique, is called the chest lever grip. And the chest lever grip, you're going to take that knife that you had all this time and you're going to turn it around 180 degrees in your hand like this. So now the blade is pointing towards you, all right? And you're going to hold it away from you like this. So you're going to turn the blade out. The material goes in the other hand, and you're going to bring it in front of you like this, and you're going to do this, and you're using your chest muscles and your back muscles to remove massive amounts of material, just like this. And this is best for exactly that, removing massive amounts of material. If you're trying to carve a tent stake where you've got to get rid of a lot of material pretty quickly to get down to a point, or if you're trying to carve a fireboard or a fire board or a fire hearth, those type things work really well for this, okay? It's pretty controlled. It keeps the knife in one spot. It's not flailing around, but it's removing mass amounts of material. You're not going to get real fine cuts off of it, although you can. But if you try to get too fine with it, you're not going to be actually using your back muscles. You're going to be trying to control the knife with this hand and kind of just do this with your wrist instead of actually using those back muscles. This is a mass material removal position, all right? So that gives you 3 knife positions. You have the normal position of using the knife right here, right beside you outside the triangle of death. You have the knee lever, which is in front of you, and you're actually on the ground, and you're pulling that material toward you. And then you have the chest lever, which is here, removing mass amounts of material like this. Okay? Okay, folks, well, I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters in the Pathfinder School, and this has been part 1 of our Simple Knife Safety series. I'll get a second part of this done as well that will cover a few other knife holding and knife cutting techniques as well. I appreciate your views. I appreciate your support. I thank you for everything you do for our school, for our family, and for our business, for all of our sponsors, instructors, affiliates, and friends, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Thanks, guys.